You noticed that you didn't bend. Not because you wanted to resist, not because you were trying to hold power. You simply stayed where you were. It showed up in small moments. You repeated the same boundary. You kept the same answer. You didn't adjust your position to match the room. At first, this felt neutral. You weren't making a statement. You weren't pushing against anyone. You were just continuing in the same way you had already chosen. You noticed it in conversations. When someone asked again, your response didn't change. When the tone shifted, your position stayed steady. You didn't mirror the shift. You noticed it in expectations. When they moved without being spoken, you didn't follow. You stayed aligned with what had already been said. You didn't reinterpret it. Nothing about this felt sharp. Your voice stayed calm. Your words stayed plain. You weren't escalating anything. From the outside, it probably looked simple, predictable. You weren't adding complexity. You weren't reacting emotionally. You were easy to understand. You noticed that you didn't offer extra explanations. You didn't justify yourself again. You didn't search for softer phrasing. You let the original meaning stand. This wasn't about proving a point. You weren't testing anyone. You weren't waiting for a reaction. You were just not moving. You noticed how ordinary it felt to stay consistent. It didn't require effort. It didn't feel brave. It felt clean. You could remember times when you would have adjusted automatically, when you would have softened to keep things smooth. This time, you didn't. You noticed that nothing else changed. Your tone stayed steady. Your timing stayed the same. Your behavior stayed familiar. You weren't closing anything down. You weren't opening anything up. You were simply remaining where you had already placed yourself. You didn't expect this to stand out. You didn't expect it to be noticed. You just stayed the same. And you noticed that this time, it mattered. Over time, you noticed how often that steadiness was met with pressure. Not directly, not all at once. It arrived in small signals that repeated themselves. You noticed it when the same request returned, slightly reframed. The words changed. The intent stayed. Your answer remained the same. You noticed it when pauses grew longer, when conversations circled instead of moving forward, when the expectation seemed to be that you would eventually shift. You noticed how often your consistency was treated as a temporary phase, as if staying the same was something you were doing for now, not something you meant. You noticed how questions became more frequent, how explanations were asked for again, how clarification was requested even though nothing had changed. You noticed how tone was used, a little more urgency, a little more emphasis, not aggressive, just persistent, as if repetition might loosen something. You noticed how people spoke around your position instead of to it, how alternatives were introduced, how flexibility was praised in general terms. You noticed how often the suggestion appeared that things could be easier, that compromise would smooth things out, that adjusting would help everyone move on. You didn't argue with that. You just didn't move. You noticed how this pattern repeated across situations, different settings, different people, the same expectation underneath. You noticed how your steadiness began to be framed as a problem to solve, not openly, quietly, through implication. You noticed how often the question wasn't whether you were wrong, it was why you wouldn't adapt. You noticed how being predictable stopped being seen as reliable, it started being seen as inconvenient. You noticed how this created a subtle standoff, not hostile, just unresolved, something waiting for release. You noticed how tempting it would have been to adjust slightly, to offer a new version, to make space. You didn't. You stayed where you were. And the pattern kept returning, again in conversation, again in expectation, again in moments that asked you to bend. You noticed how often you didn't, and how much attention that drew. Over time, You began to feel what being unmoved required from you, not as strain, not as effort, more as a steady holding that never quite relaxed. You noticed how much awareness it took to remain where you were. You had to stay present. You had to remember what you meant. You had to resist the reflex to adjust simply because pressure appeared. You noticed how your body stayed engaged, not tense, not defensive, just alert enough to keep you from shifting without intention. Like holding a position without leaning into it. You noticed how this slowed you down. You paused longer before responding. You chose words carefully, not to soften them, to keep them accurate. You noticed how often you were aware of yourself while doing this, of your tone, of your posture, of your stillness. You weren't performing it, you were maintaining it. You noticed how little relief consistency brought. There was no release in holding your line, no sense of resolution. The moment didn't move on just because you stayed steady. You noticed how isolating that could feel. Not because anyone left, because you were no longer moving with the current of the interaction. You were standing slightly apart from it. You noticed how little feedback you received. Consistency didn't invite reassurance. It didn't draw validation. It often passed without comment, even as it changed the atmosphere. You noticed how often you replayed interactions afterward, not to second-guess yourself, to track the cost, to notice how much energy it took to not bend. You noticed how easy it would have been to soften just enough, to add context, to adjust timing, to relieve the pressure. You chose not to. You noticed how staying consistent meant tolerating discomfort without resolving it. You couldn't smooth it out. You couldn't absorb it. You had to let it remain. You noticed how this sharpened your sense of control, not the control you were exerting, the control others expected you to relinquish. You noticed how visible you felt, how exposed clarity can be when it isn't cushioned by flexibility. You weren't holding tight, you were holding still, and that stillness asked more of you than you expected. You noticed that too. At some point, you noticed the shift in language. The steadiness you had lived inside for a while was given a name. It wasn't called clear, it wasn't called reliable, it was called rigid. You noticed how quickly that word appeared once you stopped adjusting, not when you argued, not when you pushed, when you stayed the same. You saw how consistency began to be framed as inflexibility, as if holding one position meant you were refusing to understand something new, as if remaining steady meant you were closing yourself off. You noticed how rarely anyone asked what you meant. The focus moved to how you were behaving instead. Your stillness became the subject, not the substance of what you were saying. You noticed how the label arrived without discussion. It wasn't negotiated, it wasn't clarified. It settled quietly, like a conclusion that explained away the discomfort. You realized that rigid wasn't describing your behavior. It was describing the effect your behavior had on others. It named the difficulty they felt when they could no longer rely on your flexibility. You noticed how the word carried judgment without accusation. It didn't say you were wrong. It said you were difficult to move. It implied that ease required your cooperation. You saw how quickly consistency becomes suspect in systems that depend on adjustment. How staying the same disrupts dynamics built on subtle shifts and unspoken concessions. You realized that being called rigid wasn't about a lack of movement. It was about a lack of access. You were no longer available to be negotiated with quietly. You noticed how this reframed earlier interactions, how often your flexibility had been mistaken for openness, how often your adjustments had been taken for granted. You saw how clarity becomes threatening when it removes ambiguity, how steadiness exposes, where control usually flows through adaptation rather than authority. You realized that the problem wasn't that you wouldn't bend, it was that bending had been expected. You weren't refusing growth, you weren't resisting change. You were simply not rearranging yourself to make things easier to manage. You noticed how plain that truth felt. Not empowering, not condemning, just accurate. You were called rigid because you stopped being movable. That was the truth. There is a moment where you stop responding to the word itself. You don't argue with it. You don't correct it. You don't try to prove that it doesn't apply. You simply notice what happens when it lands. You notice how quiet you become around it. Not withdrawn, just still. You don't rush to soften your position to counter the label. You don't rush to explain yourself into flexibility. You see how being called rigid doesn't change what you know about yourself. It doesn't alter what you meant. It doesn't require you to move. It just names the discomfort that appeared when you didn't. You notice how little there is to do with that information. No defense improves it. No clarification dissolves it. The word exists, and you exist beside it. You notice how steady you remain. Not defiant, not hardened, simply unchanged. You are still where you were before the label arrived. You notice how this is often the point where people expect a shift, an adjustment, a concession. When it doesn't come, the silence grows. You let that silence be what it is. You don't fill it. You don't manage it. You don't translate yourself into something easier to accept. You notice how being consistent means allowing others to sit with their own reaction. You no longer cushion it. You no longer redirect it. You leave it where it belongs. You see how the word rigid loses its power when it doesn't provoke movement. It doesn't resolve anything. It just hangs there, unsupported. You don't reclaim the narrative. You don't replace it with another one. You don't turn this into a statement about strength or principle. You stay present. You stay accurate. You stay still. You let the moment end without repair. You let the label exist without shaping yourself around it. You stop there. When you were called rigid,